Hello, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Caroline Stevens and I was the Brexit Campaign Manager for the EU referendum. Now, many of us will be wondering what's going on in the field of politics more so now than ever before. Chaos seems to reign, but not at all. In order to understand the bizarre behaviour and decisions of many of our politicians that seem to defy common sense, there needs to be an awareness of what our government actually represents, and unfortunately they no longer represent the people. Our will is not being done. So let's go back in time to 1960. Now, Lord Kilmuir was the Chancellor at the time, and he knew of Ted Heath's plans to take us into what was then called the European Union. Well, it was a community, and unfortunately his letter to Ted Heath was blocked on the internet, otherwise I would show you it, but I do know people out there who still have that letter that Lord Kilmuir sent to Ted Heath, warning him about the consequences. So later, when Ted Heath was asked why he deliberately lied to Parliament and the country to get the UK into the EU, he said it was necessary as the British people, and I quote, these are his words, "The British people are too stupid to be involved in governing themselves." That is the firm belief of the globalists about the world's population. Now, if you think that this is a Tory issue, then please think again. You see, the way the Lisbon Treaty was passed by Parliament in 2008 is a good example of why the red versus blue mantra is a myth propagated by the mainstream media to keep us all divided into different camps. Oh, you're a Conservative, or you're Labour, or you're a Liberal Democrat. But we're all people. We all generally have the same needs and wants. Certainly we have the same needs. So we're divided, and we're still divided. Now, you see, when we're separated like this, we forget what the goal is, and the goal is we should be focusing our attentions on the establishment, because money, the love of money, is at the heart of this beast. And this is worldwide, pretty much. Okay, so basically, when I said about Ted Heath was a Tory, he was a Conservative. So he took us into the EEC on the 1st of January 1973. But that doesn't let Labour off the hook. Oh no, which is why they were all the same. You see, the Lisbon Treaty was signed by Miliband, a Labour politician, in October 2007, without first having a referendum, which the Labour Party had promised in their party manifesto. So the unamended Treaty of Lisbon was deposited into the Commons on December the 17th, 2007. Now, most MPs had gone home for Christmas, and Parliament was to return on the 7th of January 2008. Yet the papers weren't put into the Commons reading room for the MPs to look at and to scrutinise until 11:45 on the morning that the MPs had to vote, which was, for your information, it was the 21st of January 2008. Nobody could ever read 3,000 pages. I defy anybody who can do that in such a short space of time. And considering that lots of sections in the Lisbon Treaty, you had to look at other treaties to do so, to understand what is meant in the Lisbon Treaty. Now, in the EU Parliament, incidentally, MEPs sometimes have to vote on hundreds of different matters each day. They literally don't know whether they're coming or going half the time, and there's no way that any MEP can scrutinise all the documentation put before them. So going back to the Lisbon Treaty, I will now read out some of the most important points pertaining to the Lisbon Treaty, which then came into force on the 1st of December 2009. So firstly, the UK, with all the other existing EU nations, will lose their abstention vote in 2020, as laid down in the treaty, when the system all changes to that of majority acceptance, with no abstentions or vetoes being allowed. Secondly, all member nations will become states of the new federal nation of the EU by 2022. So it's a federal nation. It's one nation. The 28 nations become one body. So it's clearly laid out in the Lisbon Treaty. I'm not quite sure why people want to dispute this. And there's going to be no exceptions or vetoes. Now, number 3, and this is very contentious as well. For some reason, it is because we're talking about money, and that's the heart of this beast, isn't it? It's about greed, money, power, one world domination. So, number 3, all member states must adopt the euro by 2022, and any new member state must do so within 2 years of joining the EU, as laid down in the Lisbon Treaty. Now, there's lots of nations queuing up that on this glide path, if you like, to join the EU. It's not just the 28 nations. There's lots more waiting in the wings. And I know people complain and say, oh, this country or that country won't ever join because of their human rights records. Well, we only have to see how human rights do not feature anymore when we look at the Yellow Vest marches, for example, or what's happening in Northern Ireland at the moment with the court cases. So for the Bloody Sunday situation. So human rights, really? Right, number 4. Now, people say, oh, the London Stock Exchange is not going to move to Frankfurt. Well, let's have a look at the evidence, because it's supposed to move to Frankfurt in 2020, which is just next year. And apparently it's going to lose 200,000 jobs because of this relocation. Now, I know it's been pre-agreed. It's only on sort of a holding situation, pending what's happening with Brexit. But having spoken to somebody in the city at the weekend, the city have been advised that there isn't going to be Brexit this year. And obviously then we will then move into the Lisbon Treaty kicking in its entirety. So let's have a look at the evidence. You know, the mainstream media only reported less than a year ago that Deutsche Bank was moving its euro clearing from London to Frankfurt. So why did they do that if we're not moving the stock exchange in its entirety to Frankfurt? Right, so I mean, how did the media tackle this situation? They basically said, oh, the move was symbolic. Yeah, you see, they just play us like fiddles. Right, in fact, their report said Deutsche Bank has moved a large part of its euro clearing activity to Frankfurt from London it's in a boost to the efforts of the Eurozone's top finance centre to lure business away from the city before Brexit. Well, the city does its own thing anyway. It's not part of the UK. The London Stock Exchange, which owns a clearing house, has warned that the loss of euro clearing could cost the city 100,000 jobs. But as I say, the City of London doesn't adhere to the EU. But it is funny that the Lisbon Treaty has already specified a move to Frankfurt. Coincidence? Leave that for you to think about. Right, on to point number 5. The EU Parliament and the European Court of Justice will then become supreme over all legislative bodies in the UK. Number 6. The UK will adopt 100% of whatever the unelected EU Commission and European Court of Justice actually lays down, without any chance of absenteeism or veto, negating the need for the UK to even have the Lords, which you might think is a good thing, but we won't have any need for the Commons either, and that's a good thing. But we're going to have central government from Brussels instead. That's not such a good thing. Right, so points 7 and 8 and 9 can be really rolled up into one point. Basically, the UK will not be able to make its own trade deals, set its own trade tariffs, or set its own trade quotas. I mean, we already know that the UK government placed on its parliamentary records in October 2016 a trade deal called the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. And that trade deal, they've actually renamed it as the Canadian trade deal, because everybody knows now that the CETA deal is really TTIP by the back door, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership by the back door, because of its links with, the American subsidiaries into Canada. It's more of the same, really. Trade deals are always to benefit the globalists. They're not to benefit for us anyway. So this CETA, which is called the Canadian Trade Deal, conveniently for our government, you remember that TTIP in 2015, 2016, millions and millions of people in Europe and hundreds of thousands in the UK did take to the streets and get people to sign petitions stopping TTIP. So what does the government do? It signs up to CETA instead. But TTIP's still waiting in the wings. So let's not be under any illusions. So, the fact that we can't sign trade deals and what have you, I mean, this will be part of the Canadian trade deal anyway. Right, number 10. Something which is quite emotive for people who are living on the coast. The UK loses its fishing rights. Well, we haven't got much control over that now anyway. I mean, was it coincidental that after the EU referendum, there was a parliamentary researcher for a Remain MP based up in the northeast? He suddenly, and bearing in mind this is after the referendum, after we said we wanted to leave, this researcher suddenly miraculously got a job in the Ports Authority. And was it any coincidence that he happened to be giving presentations to the fishing committee in December 2017? So a Remain researcher who'd been working for a Remain MP is providing evidence to a UK government talking about our fishing industry. What's that all about? Point number 11. The UK will lose its oil and gas rights. Number 12. The UK loses control of all its borders and enters the Schengen region by 2022. It's all laid out there for everybody to see if you want to read through 3,000 pages, but there is an index. Number 13, the UK loses control of its planning legislation. That's no surprise, is it? Number 14, I've covered this before, and in fact myself and a couple of others launched a Pescogate campaign in October 2016 to highlight what's happening to our military. But point number 14 in the Lisbon Treaty, the UK loses control of its armed forces, including its nuclear deterrent. And remember, our armed forces landed in Bosnia in October of last year wearing an EU logo on their arms. And this matter was raised in Parliament. It was very embarrassing, wasn't it? The government had been found out. So what happened? They just removed the logos from their arms. Well, what do you think to that? Right, so number 15. The UK loses full control of its taxation policy. Well, this shouldn't become any surprise anyway, because it was mentioned in the Independent in January and also mentioned in the Telegraph. They've reported on the fact that the European Commission will try to convince the member states of the EU later this year to give up their veto on tax legislation from Brussels. Of course it's delicate, very delicate. There's no point in having a government if they're not the ones that are telling us how much we owe them. We don't want people from Brussels telling us that we have to pay them the tax instead. Now you see, tax has been one of the most jealously guarded areas of national sovereignty. So as a result, you can think, can't you, an EU-wide tax law at the minute can only be passed by unanimity with the active support of every member government. But this could be set to change in May of this year. So, in addition, the Commission will publish a communication that will urge the Member States to switch from this unanimity to the system of qualified majority voting and to give MEPs, members of the European Parliament, a say over tax bills, and they would act as a co-legislator. Now, unlike many other policy areas, the European Parliament is not really consulted and cannot amend EU tax legislation. So we can see what's going to happen here. Now you see the EU also once nursed dreams of introducing a block-wide financial transaction tax. Now that affects shares and bonds. You know, that's going to affect your pension. If you've got pensions with insurance companies and other such organisations, what the plan is to take a percentage of the fund value and pay it to Brussels. This is called the financial transaction tax. Ask any actuary. They should be knowing about this by now, because they have to work out how much money you should put into your pension and how much money you will get out. And if there's going to be an extra tax on your pension pot, you then have to put more money in, obviously, to get the same money out. So this is another tax, courtesy of Brussels. Phew. So, where do we go from here? Well, what else have we got? We've got the UK loses its ability to create its own laws and to implement them. It will lose its standing in the Commonwealth. That's what the other countries really, really envy. The UK will lose control of provinces such as the Falklands Islands, Cayman Islands, Gibraltar. You go and try telling that to people who live in Gibraltar. And, you know, points number 19, 20 and 21 can all be rolled up by simply saying the UK loses total control of its judicial system, its national policy and its international policy. In fact, the UK loses its right to call itself a nation. How shocking is that? It will lose control of its space exploration programme, of its aviation and sea lane jurisdiction. It will lose its rebate next year, and we will have to increase our contributions to the EU by next year. So, when people say the Lisbon Treaty doesn't exist, yes it does. In fact, at the Brexit extension debate that's just been recently held in Parliament, an MP actually mentioned the Lisbon Treaty and the impact on this nation, this once great nation. So our videos are getting out there. But I do leave you with a really, really sobering thought. Why is it that none of our MPs have been speaking about the Lisbon Treaty? Why is it that our members of the European Parliament, who we sent to keep an eye on things in 2014, why haven't they been reporting about us being centrally taxed by Brussels by the middle of this year? Why is it they haven't been talking about the military side until very, very late in the day? I'll leave you with that thought. How do they all sleep at night? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you again soon. Remember, you can see me on a show, Seeking the Truth, on a Monday evening, and I host it at 9 o'clock. It goes out live. I have a variety of guests on there. I'm constantly asking people to give me their stories to be shared for the good of the nation, and it's on a website called wakeupuk.net. Take the words out of my mouth. Wake Up UK, and goodbye for now.